myself at this moment. But what I do like to do and express is to introduce Professor Emily Hicks, our last speaker, but obviously not the least. Professor Hicks is the professor of post-colonial studies, border theory, literal theory, Chicano literature, Chicana feminist theory, Rock and Espanol, writes discourse and complexity theory at San Diego State University, not far from here. She attended UCSD mid to late 1970s, I recently discovered, and she was in the study group on aesthetic that Herbert Marcuse directed. Professor Hicks' dissertation director was Michel de Certeau, which, by the way, the name of this room is after. She was trained as a Latin Americanist. Her research focuses on Deleuzian and anarchist theory and complexity science. She has collaborated on research on the border and complexity with Scripps Institute of Oceanography. At San Diego State University, Professor Hicks teaches courses on literature, literal theory, creative writing, performance, and popular culture. I very much welcome you to UCSD, and please, the title is great. Thank you.
All right. I'm really happy to be here today because I get to talk to you about Che Guevara, and I'm happy to be on this campus, UCSD, where I attended grad school, and it seems that there are some things that need to be done on this campus. Maybe we, who are also being impressed at San Diego State, can help. I'm happy to be in this room, the Certeau room, a room named after the professor who was the chair on my dissertation committee, Michel de Certeau. Certeau replaced Frederick Jameson, who was my dissertation committee chair, because Jameson decided to take a job at Yale University. When I visited Nicaragua in 1994 to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, we internationalists, that is the supporters of the revolution from outside of Nicaragua, were told on many occasions that it was essential for us to be critical of the Sandinista Revolution. We were told this by Sandinistas. It was explained to us that while our enthusiasm was appreciated, our critical eye was even more important. We were to analyze the faults, contradictions, and flaws that we observed, as well as appreciating what we saw. Because I was traveling with a black Trinidadian filmmaker, the musician Tilly Charles, we were able to comply with their wishes. We were inspired, enthusiastic, and taken aback by racism all at the same time. When we spent time in Bluefields, we were introduced to a culture that had roots in Afro-Nicaraguan culture. This talk on Che will be given in the spirit of Sandinistas and Sandinista critique as it was understood in the 1980s. I've been studying Latin America and resistance since the 6th grade when my leftist teacher, Mr. Clark at Alice Burney, a school in San Diego, taught us to be critical of the Alliance for Progress. I will argue in this presentation that it is possible to be inspired, enthusiastic, and appalled all at the same time when revisiting certain moments of the history of the left and the history of political resistance. An example on this side of the border is Nat Turner, a controversial prophet hero. Another controversial historical figure is Tecumseh. I will place Che within the history of political resistance. This will allow me to look at slave revolts, maroon populations, the Haitian Revolution, and colonialism at the same time. It will also allow me to leave concerns about precise historical details, research about the USSR, the CIA, and how and why Che died, and acts that he did or did not commit to others. I'm concerned with patterns of resistance. My approach allows me to remind those living in the US, regardless of ethnicity, social class, and gender, that there's a history of struggle and resistance that can be traced back to the Great Dismal Swamp and George Washington's desire to drain it. Mixed ancestry populations, free persons of color, natives, poor whites, and others have resisted colonialism in the Americas since the conquest. In order to think about the question of what Che means for us today, it's useful to remember the history of resistance. I'm not an expert on the life of Che Guevara. My background is in literature, and more specifically, Argentine literature and the work of Julio Cortazar. I will discuss how Che has been represented in literature in the work of Cortazar. Cortazar, an enthusiast of and supporter of the Cuban Revolution, was also able to observe its contradictions and inconsistencies. His love for Che can be seen in a letter and a poem that he wrote after Che's death, addressed to Roberta Fernandez Retamar and his wife Adelaida. His critical perspective of the revolution can be seen in the short story he wrote, Reunión, in which he used irony and humor to present aspects of Che that enhanced the portrait of the revolutionary hero. So much information and disinformation is now available on the internet about Che, and details and revelations about his life that were shocking, once shocking, and are no longer so much. So, however, most of us wear Che t-shirts with pride, perhaps a misplaced belief that we're supporting struggles for justice in Latin America and the world through a t-shirt. We live with the cognitive dissonance of what happened or may have happened, in part because we are concerned with events that have occurred since the Cuban Revolution and Che's death, including the Sandinista Revolution and the Zapatista movement. Within the current context of the United States, a context that includes Trump and DACA, when we see an image of Che, most of the on the left still feel a surge of there's still hope. I've spoken to many on the left in preparing these remarks, and the general consensus is that despite the complexities and contradictions of Che's life and death, his contributions deserve recognition. Now I want to talk about what it was like to be on this campus in the mid-1970s to late 1970s. UCSD in the late 70s. Because San Diego was very conservative in the 70s, and the anti-CA coalition on this campus was very strong at UCSD, I thought it might be useful to evoke for you a vision of what it was like to be a student on this campus in those days. The euphoria that we sometimes experience, for example, when the Frankfurt School professor Herbert Marcuse, who taught at UC San Diego, would speak at our political events, was palpable. We felt, or at least I did, a certain kind of protection. It was an illusion, of course, because Marcuse himself was constantly under attack, but he continued to fight, and so did we. He'd been told that he had to retire in 1970. However, he had an office on campus where he continued to meet with students, and he socialized with us at his house in La Jolla. In my view, the naming of the Che Cafe cannot be understood without attention to the broader context of the history of UCSD, which includes Third College, previously named Lumumba Zapata. In addition, our understanding of the Third World, revolution, and political resistance was shaped by the presence on campus and the writings of Marcuse. We knew that Angela Davis had been Marcuse's favorite student. We had a sense of being in some way connected to the Black Panther Party, despite our varied backgrounds, by proxy in some imaginary way. While we may have romanticized and exaggerated a sense of agency, we experienced a sense of agency. We saw ourselves not as helpless and without hope, but rather as angry, frustrated, and yet powerful, as student activists armed with our understanding of Frankfurt theory, the debates surrounding the work of Walter Benjamin, and related topics. In 1970, while still living in the Bay Area before coming to UC San Diego, I'd written to the pretrial hearings of Angela Davis in Marin County with her lawyers. I'd been hitchhiking to the hearing, and they picked me up. Javier Setnes Castro discusses Angela Davis in his book on Marcuse. At first, Angela Davis's defense was linked to that of Michel McGee. Davis owned the gun that was used in the attempt to help George Jackson escape. I did not meet Marcuse until later in the mid-1970s when I completed my BA in Spanish and entered the PhD program at UCSD in literature. I was in the Marcuse study group on aesthetics in the late 70s. In 1970, as Castro explains, Marcuse did everything he could to defend Angela Davis. For me, as someone born into an anarchist family with ties to Italian anarchists on the East Coast, I was part of a generation that was supposed to be in the streets. We believed that we stopped the war in Vietnam. My uncle Mo Moskowitz, an anarchist, had spent time in jail for his political activities during World War II. He was an anarchist pacifist. There was no question for me that I was part of something much larger. When I came to UCSD, having attended UC Berkeley, I was grateful to be part of the 350 or so students who demonstrated on this campus on a regular basis. Marcuse argued that the non-integrated groups of society, and I'm quoting, youth, the women, the black and brown population, the young workers, the intelligentsia, all of that from the book by Castro, had a special role to play. Edward Said made a similar argument in his book, Orientalism, and Cornel West made this argument on CNN recently with regard to Trump, athletes, and the flag. Marcuse argued that art is important because it opens a space for thinking, and I would add to that, border thinking. We can juxtapose the totally administered society, which Gilles Deleuze's discussion of the disciplinary society and societies of control. At this point, I want to discuss the notion of radical subjectivity, a concept of Marcuse's that refers to a refusal of current conditions. This refusal or negation may appear to be incompatible with the Nietzschean affirmation found in Deleuze's work. I argue that this is not the case. Nevertheless, the radical subjectivity put forward by Marcuse can be said to be embodied in Che Guevara. The concealing of contradictions is very important in Marcuse's work. Complexity science takes a different approach to reveal that which has been hidden. Complexity science looks for patterns. These patterns reveal themselves when a stacked hierarchy is used to analyze systems and system boundaries. And my own research with B.T. Warner at Scripps, we found a way to reconcile aspects of Michael Hart and Tony Negri's concept of empire with the description of the Mexico-US border. A concept of self-organization can be found in the work of Deleuze and Marcuse. From a complexity science approach, self-organization and resistance can be studied in relation to one another. On a side note, important for Deleuzians, a distinction must be made between Marcuse's concepts of negation and the dialectic, on the one hand, and Deleuze's Nietzschean-inspired category of affirmation. These categories are related to assimilation and acculturation. Since Che's image has been assimilated and commodified, these are all important categories in this discussion. In complexity terms, that which may be oppositional or subversive on a shorter time scale may lose its subversive power on a longer time scale. I want to mention one more detail, Ricky Sherover. Ricky Sherover was Marcuse's wife, whom he married after his first wife, Inga, had died in 1972, and she and I were friends. She attended my dissertation defense. I saw her right after she came back from Germany, after Marcuse died, and I know one of the people at the funeral service held soon after Marcuse's death, Moishe Poston. The Castro book explains the details of the cremation of Marcuse's body and the custody and care of Marcuse's ashes. I now want to discuss how we, grad students and undergrads in the Lit department, created heroes and thought about the Cuban Revolution, and tried to make sense of the very different perspectives of our professors, because I was in the study group along with Peter Samuel Taylor, Charles Singer, who's here, and Irene Catalan, whose father taught in the department. I had a broader critical space in which to think, to do research, and to function as an anarchist. An anarchist in the department was Ellen Bamberger. There were Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, feminists, Chicano nationalists, and many others on the campus or associated with the campus in some way as members of study groups. At one point, despite my own viewpoints as one obsessed with the Evertad case, Theodore Adorno, and experimental literature, I participated in a Communist Labor Party study group in which I deepened my understanding. And you have to understand, our groups were very relaxed. They were bilingual, bicultural. Este pinche vato Marx, that's how we just referred to him. And my milieu is shaped most intensely by the students who were reading Adorno and Marcuse. It was possible to be critical of certain aspects of the Cuban Revolution and to talk about Padilla and Vladimir Mayakovsky. It was possible to be part of the left and to function in the department and to discuss the debates that divided the left. We watched slightly terrified our professors disagree with one another. Rosara Sanchez was formidable. Carlos Blanco, who taught in the department, told me, "Calmate, mujer," on many occasions. It was difficult to stay calm when we were upset in any given moment about department rules for completing our degrees, grades, who was on sabbatical, and homophobia in Cuba, all at the same time. My method. This is not going to be a Stalinist, nor a Leninist, nor a Trotskyist approach to the life and death of Che Guevara. Instead, I will look at an event that occurred on a shorter time scale of less than a day, as reported by many, an event that took place at a schoolhouse. The meaning of this event was coupled with two longer time scale phenomena. First, the deification of Che by a group of left-wing Catholic militants, followers of Jacques Maritain, and second, the turning point or bifurcation from guerrilla warfare to the Cuban-USSR relationship as the dominant strategy for liberation in Latin America. Both of these events, the death of Che and the bifurcation from one kind of warfare to a new configuration within the Cold War context, can now, after the publication of Michael Hart and Tony Negri's Empire, be seen in relation to empire. Hart and Negri have published a new book, Assembly. They argue that the political innovation required today is produced collectively. It isn't invented by leaders of any sort. Andrew Greenberg discusses through Certeau in relation to Bruno Latour and actor network theory in his book, Questioning Technology. Greenberg's influences include the Christian anarchist Jacques Ellul. My approach to how Che has been represented in literature, and more specifically in Cortazar's short story, Meeting, and to the appropriation of Che in popular culture, is based in complexity science. Other critics who have used a similar method to discuss culture include Gilles Deleuze and Manuel de Landa. I'm interested in how the fractal, that's F-R-A-C-T-A-L, fractal narrative created by Cortazar, at once experimental, irreverent, and yet still supportive of the Cuban Revolution, reveals fractures in the left and in revolutionary struggles in Latin America. How did Cortazar think about the relationship between literature and political struggle? How can we discern his views in the short story Meeting? These are the questions that interest me. And now I'm going to analyze a short story by Julio Cortazar, Meeting. The short story Meeting, published in English in the collection All Fires the Fire, begins with the memory of Che's, originally published in La Sierra y Llano. Quote, I recalled a Jack London story in which the hero leans calmly against a tree and prepares to die in a dignified manner. End of quote. I will argue that the story is about dying in a dignified manner, as well as about who will take over after the death of a leader. We know the history. Che was killed in 1967. Fidel Castro lived until he was 90. He died in 2016. We know that the photographs of Che's corpse helped to martyrize and deify him as a Christ-like figure in the style of the artist Mantegna. Vittorio Scarbi has lectured on this topic. There's something miraculous in Cortazar's story. It's a miracle to come when there will be a convergence of sound and space, of melodies, music, violins, stringed instruments, and tree branches. The main characters in the story are Luis, based on Fidel Castro, Pablo, based on Raúl Castro, and the narrator Che. In this analysis, I'm going to explain how a complexity perspective can help us to approach these images: courage, death, trees, music, fractals. Fractals are ending patterns, self-similar across different scales. I will refer to the narrative structure as a fractal narrative. The story is structured in relation to Mozart's The Hunt, a piece in 4 parts. Cortazar writes, quote, even though Mozart and the tree cannot know, we too in our way have wanted to transpose a clumsy war into an order that gives it meaning, justifies it, and finally carries it to a victory. That might be like the restoration of a melody after so many years of raucous hunting horns. That final allegro, which follows the adagio like an encounter with light. What a kick Luis would get out of knowing that at this moment I'm comparing him to Mozart, seeing him put this recklessness in order little by little, a musician of men. With respect and humor, Cortazar represents Fidel as a musician of men. Cortazar wants you, the reader, to visualize and experience a sort of light show at a trip-hop concert, psychedelic and transformative. I'm now going to refer to something in Spanish, but I will summarize it in English that you can find online, which is what this story is about. A group of guerrilla fighters embarks to the island of Cuba. Their leaders arrived earlier. They have to meet him at a predetermined location. The story narrates the adventures they suffer from at the time of their arrival. They're menaced by enemy planes. Their main worry is that they will not be able to meet with him. The narrator, one of the fighters, will have to become the leader if Luis is killed. While incomplete, the Wikipedia entry does not emphasize an important point. Che will have to lead the fighters if Fidel fails. Is this Cortazar's opinion of the period of 65 and 66? Cortazar had already traveled to Cuba in 61 with his second wife. He supported the revolution at that time. Did he foresee Che's death in Bolivia in 1967, even though the story purports to be about Cuba? Was he merely being logical? If anything happened, it was likely that Raúl or second-in-command Che would have to take over. Why did Cortazar write a story that was fictional in the neo-vanguard tradition when Cubans had already written accounts in the authentic testimonial genre? Cortazar's magical, mystical, surreal language has biblical overtones. In Che's view, they must be like Luis Fidel, to whom he refers to as the Pantocrator, a Greek term referring to a specific image of Christ as a mild but stern judge who separates lands from waters. One character, Pablo, states that the place where the group will meet up with Luis, that is Fidel, will, quote, be like being in a church, end of quote. Was Cortazar, in a subtle manner, criticizing the Cuban Revolution, and if so, why? Why did Cortazar create a character, Che, who believed that guerrilla fighters had to be like Fidel, a mild but stern judge? Was Fidel mild? Was Che mild? Was Cortazar being ironic? And this won't help answer that question, but it is the end of the story. I saw how the leaves and branches were bending little by little to my desire. They were my melody, Luis's melody, whose talk was miles apart from my fantasies. And I saw a star inscribed in the center of the sketch. And it was a little star and very blue. And though I don't know anything about astronomy and wouldn't be able to say whether it was a star or a planet, I did feel sure that it was neither Mars nor Mercury. It shined too much in the center of the adagio, too much in the center of Luis's words to be mistaken for Mars or Mercury. And keep this image of the star in mind because it will come up again in the poem. Cortazar's views on literature and politics. Cortazar, a supporter of the Cuban Revolution by '61, found himself uncomfortable a decade later. Ben Ehrenreich writes in an article in The Nation, by the time he wrote that letter to Fernandez Retamar, the radical artistic openness that marked the early days of the revolution was decidedly on the wane. Cortazar found himself under attack from his supposed comrades for irrationalism, obscurantism, and even the eroticism of his prose. In '71, the increasingly autocratic revolution's relationship with his international fellow travelers had reached a crisis. After the Cuban secret police arrested the poet and novelist Eberta Padilla, some 50 prominent European and Latin American leftist intellectuals, Cortazar amongst them, attached their signatures to a polite open letter to Fidel, published in Le Monde, asking the Cuban leader to, quote, re-examine the situation, end of quote. Now I'm going to talk about Cortazar and a comic book, Fantômas contra las multinacionales. In Meeting, Cortazar tells the story of the Cuban Revolution in an experimental, non-socialist, realist manner by beginning with the recollection of Che Guevara's. That is, he mixes non-fiction and fiction. In Fantômas contra las multinacionales, we find Cortazar mixing reality and fiction. In this case, the real Cortazar was included as an intellectual light of the day in a real comic book. A friend gave Cortazar a copy. This inspired him to write a short novel, and again, the topic is social change, and again, the approach to social change is convoluted. We know that Cortazar's weapon of choice was not an AK-47. It was literature. However, in his novel based on a comic about him, he includes parts of the original comic and its plot in which Fantômas battles against a plot to destroy all the books in the world. But he also adds elements of his own, including the 1975 Second Russell Tribunal on repression in Brazil, Chile, and Latin America. Thus, after all of the turmoil that Cortazar had put himself through regarding political commitment, stretching back to his days dealing with Peronismo, he's now ironically faced with a new challenge. Books are being destroyed. His rationale for engaging in political struggle through writing and literature rather than by other means is undercut to some degree if he does not act to save books. We read the following about the comic. Fantômas, the creation of Marcel Alain and Pierre Soudestre in their 1911 novel and dozens of sequels, was reappropriated and reimagined in the Mexican comic book series Fantômas. In issue 201 of the series, we find Fantômas battling a plot to destroy all the books of the world, Operation Gabriel's Sword. Part of the story has Fantômas calling on leading intellectual lights of the day, and I'll name four: Susan Sontag, Alberto Moravia, Octavio Paz, and Julio Cortázar. One of those, Moravia, is important because he was a novelist and a journalist, and at least two famous directors made films about his work, Bertolucci and Godard. Fantômas versus the multinational vampires finds the narrator picking up a copy of the comic at a newsstand. He rushes to catch a train back to Paris from Brussels, where he participates in the 1975 Russell Tribunal. Thus, the real Cortázar has written a novel about himself as represented in the comic book, and he's added a new element, the Second Russell Tribunal. Now I'm going to talk about Michael Hart and Tony Negri. In his review of Empire, in an article in the New Left Review, Balakrishnan writes, Hart and Negri open their case by arguing that although the nation-state-based systems of power are rapidly unraveling force fields of world capitalism, globalization can be understood as cannot be understood as a simple process of deregulating markets. Far from withering away, regulations today proliferate and interlock to form an acephalous supranational order, which the authors choose to call empire. The term as they use it refers not to a system in which tribute flows from peripheries to great capital cities, but to a more Foucauldian figure, a diffuse, anonymous network of all-englobing power. Hart and Negri claim that the sinews of this phantasmic polity, its flows of people, information, and wealth, are simply too unruly to be monitored from metropolitan control centers. And now I'm going to try to bring together Hart and Negri, who only some people think are anarchists, closer to some parts of Marcuse as read through one person, Castro, even though these people, if you ask them individually, are you an anarchist, they may not use that term. Their account of its origins adds a few striking nuances to a now familiar story. An older, status world of ruling class and proletariat, of dominant core and periphery, is breaking down. And in its place, a less dichotomous and more intricate pattern is emerging. Empire could be described as the planetary gestalt of these flows and hierarchies. The logic of this volatile totality transgresses all the inherited divisions of political thought: state and society, war and peace, control and freedom, core and periphery, blurred beyond recognition. The advent of this empire is thus not merely an momentous episode in world history. It is an event of considerable ontological importance, heralded here in the voice of impassioned prophecy. From a complexity perspective, the gestalt of flows and hierarchies can be described, and I'm going to use a term from physics, as an attractor. Now I'm going to talk about zombie Che Guevara. Fortunately for me, there's already a zombie Che Guevara t-shirt. And while vampires and zombies overlap in Richard Matheson's I'm Legend, the political point that the creator of the t-shirt about zombies has a zombie in it, not vampires. The text says, "Revolution is dead. The zombie apocalypse has begun." A companion t-shirt shows Rosie the Riveter as a zombie with the caption, "We will eat you." Revolutionaries and zombies appear together in the Cuban film Juan of the Dead. Juan is shown with Che Guevara. Now I want to talk about Don Quixote, Che, and for literary lit students, the concept of immersion. When Cortazar places Che in a story in which Che remembers, as he did in fact recall in episodes of the Revolutionary War, a story by Jack London, we're witnessing the use of the technique of immersion. Matei Chiaya writes about Cortazar and immersion and Cortazar's continuity of parks. Maria Orion has also written about this. The theme of the danger of immersion has not awaited the advent of the electronic age to be thematized in Western literature. Its most celebrated victim is probably Don Quixote. As Cervantes writes in short, he so immersed himself in those romances that he spent whole days and nights over his books, and thus, with little sleeping and reading, his brain dried up to such a degree that he lost his use of reason. Now I want to talk about affective labor, and this is important for people trying to figure out how to deal with traditional Marxist categories and to describe what it is we do today as workers and laborers. The type of labor in which Cortazar claims Fidel Castro is engaged may be said to involve immaterial, affective labor. Let me explain. Cortazar compares Luis to a composer. Let us consider this category of affective labor in relation to music. Immaterial labor includes knowledge, and it may be extended to include music. David Canfield writes the following about immaterial labor. He references Hart and Negri's book, Empire. In Multitude, immaterial labor is defined as labor which, quote, creates immaterial products such as knowledge, information, communication, a relationship, or an emotional response. Hart and Negri note that there are two kinds of immaterial labor, although most jobs characterized by immaterial labor involve both. One is primarily intellectual and linguistic, as problem-solving, symbolic or analytical tasks, and linguistic expressions. The other is affective, involving both body and mind. Labor that produces or manipulates affects such as a feeling of ease, well-being, satisfaction, excitement, or passion. Jobs with a significant affective dimension, they point out, are usually filled by low-paid, low-status women workers who, unlike factory workers, are appropriately described as alienated. And that might sound strange, but it's because Negri doesn't agree with the Marxist use of the term alienation. And so I've spoken with Michael Hart about this. An example would be a hospital worker in the ICU, giving so much care and concern. It goes beyond the way that many Marxists, especially Marxist-Leninists, look at work. Now I'm going to talk about Cortazar, Che, postmodernism, and someone named Cilliers. Bob Price in The Myth of Postmodern Science argues that the concept of bifurcation and complexity science must be distinguished from Foucault's concept of rupture. This might lead the reader to find Foucault's work to be incompatible with that of complexity science. I disagree. Based on work I've done with E.T. Werner on the border and complexity, we can see that Deleuze's essay on Foucault fits quite nicely into a complexity analysis. And the societies of control, or to use a related term of Marcuse's, the totally administered society, we find that the geographic border has proliferated. Now the border has extended to longer timescales to include one's name appearing on the manifest when one attempts to board a flight. If that name matches a no-fly list name, one will not be allowed to board. And now what I want to do is quickly go over timeline because many of you did not live through these events. So 1928, that's when Che was born. 1954, he meets Fidel. 61, Cortazar visits Cuba with his second wife, and it's a turning point in his life. He becomes a supporter of the revolution. In 63, his most famous book is written, Hopscotch. 66, and I'm skipping the Cuban Missile Crisis here. In 66, the short story we're talking about was written. 67, Che is shot and killed in Bolivia at the age of 39, and Cortazar writes the poem. 2016, Fidel dies. So now I'm going to read the this poem in Spanish first and then in English. Yo tuve un hermano, no nos vimos nunca, pero no importaba. Yo tuve un hermano que iba por los montes, mientras yo dormía. Lo quise a mi modo, lo tomé su voz libre como el agua, caminé de a rato cerca de su sombra. No nos vimos nunca, pero no importaba. Mi hermano despierto, mientras yo dormía. Mi hermano mostrándome detrás de la noche su estrella elegida. And now in English. I had a brother. We never saw each other, but that doesn't matter. I had a brother who walked around the hills while I was sleeping. I loved him in my own way. I drank his voice free like water. I walked at times near his shadow. We never saw each other, but that didn't matter. My brother awake while I slept. My brother pointing out to me from behind the night, his chosen star. So the image there is star. That's what we're thinking about. And now, in conclusion, we at UCSD can draw on the resources provided by a member of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, the French literary critic Michel, all the people who have spoken here, the people in this room. The openness of Marcuse to new approaches to Marxism is the legacy that he's left us. I don't only refer to his attempt to synthesize Marx and Freud, but his concern with non-Europeans with third world populations. Andrew Feenberg observed that there's a similarity between the action theory of Certeau and Latour's action networks. Feenberg refers to Marcuse as a left dystopian with regard to his attitude towards technology. But we don't have to look at things that way. We can think about technology in different ways. Anarchists in the Mexico-US border region, inspired by the Zapatista use of technology, have organized no border camps, including one in Sherman Heights. Javier Setnes Castro has made it possible to read Marcuse to an anarchist, libertarian, Wobbley's IWW perspective. Taken together with Cilier's work, we can approach the image of Che as it has come to us through Cortazar, Certeau, and the Frankfurt School. We can wear Che t-shirts, perhaps ironically, with an understanding of cultural appropriation. From a complexity perspective, we can see that on a shorter time scale, it may be subversive, but not so much on a longer time scale. In Cortazar's letter in 67 to Roberto Fernandez Retamar and his wife, he includes a poem. Could he have seen the events of May 68? And this is why, even in these very hard times, I want us to think about our situation. I say, no, he could not. And I talk about how the sort of despair that people were feeling right before 68, and I think we're in a similar time. There's another more hopeful image. Well, first of all, I'll talk about the less hopeful one. His death occurred on the shortest time scale of less than a day. The events surrounding his death occurred on a longer time scale. That included politics and perhaps betrayal. The machinic assembly that may describe his death includes his murderer, a weapon, and his corpse. There's another more hopeful image or assemblage formed by the machinic assemblage of Julio Cortazar being shown a star, a favorite star, and perhaps a North Star or guiding star, and the revolutionary showing him that star, Che Guevara. We cannot predict what will happen between now and a year from now. Just as Cortazar in 67 could not imagine the resistance of workers, students, and others in the streets in Paris in May 68. We cannot anticipate turning points. We can, however, engage in resistance, inspired by the event of the Cuban Revolution and one of its participants, Che Guevara. Resistance can take many forms. Marcuse, inspired by Latin American revolutionaries, encouraged action. Perhaps the result of our resistance will be to push the system toward a new attractor. It is possible that our political and cultural resistance could have such a result, despite our inability to predict or control the outcome of our resistance. May our faith that this could occur sustain us. Thank you.
Make a pitch, actually, for the continuity from today. And it's a simple one. And if you're here on campus or even if you're not, and that is that although the Che Cafe is officially registered as a student organization, and always has been on this campus, it would be a political mistake and a cultural mistake to think that students are the only ones that have built the Che Cafe and that keep it going. And the new lease that we have, actually, one of the victories of it is explicit language in there that alumni and faculty and staff on campus, community supporters of the project, and their family members are all very welcome to be full-blooded members of the collective and to be part of the consensus decision process of what the Che is, what it does in life. And so anyone here that has any interest in sustaining what Arun Gupta said in his recent article about the Save the Che Cafe campaign, that it's one of the spaces of hope. And that it takes the effort of everyone, large and small, who cares about these things, to keep these places alive.
In fact, originally I wanted to have this event at Che Cafe. Obviously, we can't do that.
Yeah, the construction work going on.
So this is something for the future, you know, that events like these could be organized. And I love these references to poetry sessions that Che Cafe had back in the 60s, well, 70s. And this is something that we could think about in the future. And I think this is a welcome suggestion, absolutely.
We have Mario here who did the Chicano Legacy mural.
Yes, that's
which was
right.
also a coup in itself to get the university to acknowledge the importance of this type of artwork and present it in a glass mosaic that will last longer than most buildings on this entire campus. So we have an opportunity to stage another coup with three-dimensional monolithic artwork at the property where, you know, if you want to talk, Mario, a little bit about what's possible.
I think that we've had 50 years here of life, and one would think that we could not surpass what we have there already with these murals there, but somehow it's already the past, and we're in the present. We are still alive, and we're looking towards the future. So we need to mark this year with something big.
Yeah.
And it's something that perhaps should go at Chicano Park, but I think it can happen here. And that is to build a sculpture of Che Guevara right in front of there, not life size, but something that almost sticks up over the roof line, like, you know, maybe the bus standing there as though he's there, kind of like smiling at the world, but at the same time protecting our golem, kind of our giant, our protector, our colossus. So, and then it could be very expensive, you know, because it's three-dimensional and how that's worked. But I've done one at Chicano Park. It's just a cut-out silhouette in metal. From a distance, and you paint it, it looks three-dimensional until you get close and you see it's flat. So it could be accomplished very cheaply, you know, reachable. Instead of being a three-dimensional bronze or something, I mean, that's $100,000. There's something like this is something that we could raise the money to do, and it would be really a blow to continue our beating up the system.
Just a footnote on the mural. I want to come back to what you just said. The mural was under attack. I don't know if you heard about this. There were people that wrote the wall, you know, something with reference to Trump's wall, and how the idea of basically immigrants coming in as something that of course that mural represents, which is...
That happened recently?
I remember a few months ago. This was during the beginning of Trump era. I may be not completely 100%, but I do know something happened with that and it was protected. So I guess my point is that we shouldn't take these things for granted, that these are sites that could be easily attacked. You know, not too many people are attacking that stupid looking bear over there, the stone bear, but somehow they like to attack that. And obviously there's a politics behind it, even though there's a lot of politics involved in the privatization of public space and how much money, private money is coming to these events, to these kind of art, public art. So I welcome that. I think that's fantastic.
An attack on artwork becomes part of the history
Yes,
of the art.
of course.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
I saw it. It was large enough. We wanted attack. The attack means that it will really...
It's actually part of
be
the art
effective.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because you could reach it, and we fix it up really quick, you know, just a face. Let it be all splashed in color. We go and add more color to it.
Fantastic. We'll talk about this.
Yeah.
There's also the opportunity of bringing sponsorship into this and being able to turn the Che area into a little bit more sustainability. So we have more of the food growing on site. The cafe itself can be producing its own electricity. The cafe can be harvesting water and really share the program of your own healing, of your own electricity, of your own water, and your own housing.
Self-sustainability.
Right, so if we can start that path, Monty, what do you think?
So the Che Cafe Collective meets every week.
Yeah.
All these ideas can be put on an agenda anytime anybody wants. And all you want to have something start happening is a consensus of the collective.
Right.
And while the Che is closed for construction, the building, the collective meets at the food co-op in the second student center, what's now called the old student center. So
That's the second Che?
Huh?
That's the second
The-
Che.
Well, the other three co-ops that are the other three co-ops that are sister collectives are in this the Groundwork Bookstore, the food co-op, and the general store collective co-op. They're all in the other building, which is the second student center, which is the only one that was ever called the student center.
Okay.
Now people are calling it the old student center because they like to, denigrate the fact that it's not 5 stories high.
Those guys.
It's not 5 stories high like the Price Center. So, and it's old, right?
But the student groups are made.
It's like 30 or 40 years old, that's really old.
Some of them are.
And when is this meeting?
The Che meets every week, 7 o'clock on Monday nights.
So we should all head over there now.
Now?
Yeah.
Perfect. The meeting's going on.
March over there.
Collective, let's go.
Since time is so limited, can I just ask one question I wanted to ask? I mean, actually, it relates to what we are saying here. And the question has to do with, Marty also talked about the picture of Ho Chi Minh and how the Vietnamese student came. And obviously, I could imagine if Che's image is out there, Cuban Americans want to come out, some of them might come out. My question goes back to this idea of reappropriating Che in terms of the military figure. And how do you see this playing a role in which now in the Trump era, we could think about Che in a very different way, in the way you just discussed it, in a very interesting way. Do you have any comments with that? Of course, I'm making reference to how many would see, some people would see Che as a problematic figure.
Right.
I think we already talked about, some people, vegetarians, for instance, thinking that, he represents violence, revolution, and so what spaces are there for us to rethink Che in context which you were talking about?
I want to say that I don't have any more than what I gave you in that paper. I was afraid to give this. I was grateful to Monty for contacting me. I think we talked about Palestinians because that was even less controversial, if you can imagine, as a way of building trust so that we could then move to, are you kidding me? I'm going to get up and defend a guy who was suspected of blah, 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 blah. But I've been very happy here that we provided such a broad context for the discussion. And I think that that's our challenge, is to maybe not have a vegan burrito at Pokey's where nobody's a heroin addict. I'm not saying we can be miracle workers, but building on the incredible diversity of all of the activists here and all the different backgrounds, I think that's going to be the challenge.
Okay.
Because I thought that it was even more provocative to talk about Ho Chi Minh the way that you did, because that was even going beyond the entire discussion here about talking about Che. But I'm interested in turning it around on you. As someone who came here and has to deal in your life with being formed by a revolution that some of the students here don't even know about. And they can't get around or back straight, much less anything else. And yet it was so formative. And there are parts of your own political formation that at one point might have meant one thing to you and then it's changed. So was there anything about what you heard here today, if we shift from this region to
I think,
Latin America?
in fact, last spring we had an event on revolutions, global revolutions. And one thing I think we discussed, especially actually, I remember it happened in this classroom, was this paradox in revolutions. The paradox is this. The spirit of the revolution as it begins is incredible. It's about change, it's about total change. But down the line, as the revolution unfolds, there is a reign of terror. And it is really the reign of terror which really brings about the complexity of how we could understand revolution. My relation, especially to the Iranian Revolution, is that original spirit. the reign of terror, it killed a lot, it included my father. But at the same time, I do very much like to admire that spirit, because it is that spirit that really wanted something different. And that includes the student movement here in the 1960s, that included the Cuban Revolution. Now, we could easily judge history looking at it from the so-called present. But really, I don't think our job should not be judging it. Really, it's just really a matter of looking back and rethinking about how these events are still shaping our lives. Famously, I don't know if you've heard about this, someone asked, I think asked a Chinese historian about the impact of the French Revolution, and he said, we still have not seen its complete impact. And I think that's something that we need to keep in our minds, that these things are still unfolding. We're still living with Che. We're still living with the legacy of the French and the Cuban, the Haitian Revolution. And there's no way for us to say that this is really what happened and we should just move on. So this is an open-ended question at this moment. And I really see ourselves still in that revolutionary stage.
And you and I talked before about being in sort of third zones.
Yeah, third zones.
I was born into the anarchist pacifist tradition. And there are people who I'd like to be here tonight, but I didn't invite them because I don't know if you've ever talked to an anarchist who doesn't really think so much of pacifism as a strategy or a tactic, but they wouldn't have been so into hearing me talk about a different tradition. Even though that's my primary political identity here locally, is this particular group. But I didn't tell them about this because I didn't want to get into an AK-47 by We Are La Peace again, because I already know what they think. So I use the fact that I was born into this very bizarre tradition to raise the issues, but it doesn't mean that I have a fixed view.
Yeah, and I think the key word you use is diversity. Precisely. And I remember I gave a talk in Havana, University of Havana, and I was trying to, my talk was, actually I started with Che Cafe, I think I mentioned in the email. I started with images of Che Cafe. I talked about the campaign, and I remember the University of Havana faculty were like amazed. They didn't know that such a thing as Che Cafe exists. And as I continued, what I talked about was socialism in its diversity. And I was talking about how there are different forms of socialism. And of course, there's a Leninist Marxist tradition in Cuba, but I think at the end there was this awareness that we have multiple really histories. And these histories need not to exclude each other.